What if the most important energy resource on the planet wasn't oil, wasn't lithium, and wasn't sitting under the Middle East, Russia, or China? What if the single largest stockpile of nuclear fuel in the world was buried under the red earth of South Australia, and the country sitting on top of it doesn't even run a nuclear power plant? That country is Australia. And what's happening right now in the global race for uranium is one of the most quietly significant power shifts of the 21st century. Stick with me for the next 12 minutes, because if you care about where the world gets its energy and who controls it, this changes how you see everything. Let's start with the demand side, because the numbers are staggering. Right now, nuclear energy powers roughly 10% of the world's electricity across more than 30 countries. That's not a niche. That's 400 plus reactors keeping the lights on for billions of people. And then came the nuclear renaissance. In September 2025, the World Nuclear Association published its flagship nuclear fuel report, the most authoritative forecast of its kind. Their conclusion was clear. Global uranium demand is expected to rise by 28% by 2030. We're talking about climbing from roughly 67,000 tons a year today to nearly 87,000 tons annually within 5 years. But that's just the opening act. By 2040, the WNA project's demand could more than double, exceeding 150,000 tons per year. At COP29 in November 2024, 31 countries pledged to triple global nuclear capacity by 2050. And Goldman Sachs, not exactly a climate charity, has put out analysis forecasting a uranium supply deficit of around 17,500 tons by 2030, growing to roughly 100,000 tons by 2045. Let me be clear about what that means. It means the world is building reactors faster than the mining industry can supply them with fuel. So who has the uranium? That's where this story gets very interesting. Here's a fact that stops most people cold. Australia holds approximately 28 to 32% of all the recoverable uranium on Earth. That's not a slight edge, that's a commanding lead. To put it in perspective, Kazakhstan, the country that currently mines more uranium than anyone else, holds about 13% of global reserves. Australia holds more than double that. And the centerpiece of Australia's reserves is a single site in South Australia called Olympic Dam. Olympic Dam is the largest known uranium deposit on the planet. Not one of the largest, the largest, with over 2.5 million tons of uranium oxide sitting in the ground beneath it. That one deposit alone would supply decades of global reactor demand. Australia isn't just sitting on uranium. It's sitting on the world's biggest uranium tank. And that tank is beginning to fill the world's reactors in a serious way. In 2023, Australia produced 4.27 thousand tons of uranium. In the financial year ending June 2024, that generated AUD 1.19 billion in export revenue. That figure is about to grow considerably. Global Data's Uranium Outlook to 2030 projects Australia's output reaching 5.1 thousand tons in 2024 and peaking at 6.83 thousand tons per year by 2029. Why? Because new mines are coming online. The Honeymoon mine in South Australia restarted in 2024 after more than a decade in care and maintenance. By 2027, it's expected to reach peak production of around 854 tons annually. And that's just one project. The Nolans project is expected to begin in 2025, Biggerley in 2026, Westmoreland and Wiluna in 2027, Mulga Rock in 2028. The world's biggest uranium tank is about to increase its flow rate, at precisely the moment the world needs it most. Now here's the part most coverage misses. Australia's uranium advantage isn't just geological. It's legal, diplomatic, and institutional. Every kilogram of uranium that leaves Australia travels under a strict bilateral nuclear cooperation agreement. Australia has 24 of these agreements in force, covering 43 countries and Taiwan. The buyers include France, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, the United States, China, Canada, Sweden, Finland, Belgium, and Spain. Under Australia's regime, enforced by the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office, known as ASNO, uranium must be used exclusively for peaceful, civilian purposes. It cannot be diverted to weapons. It cannot be re-enriched beyond agreed thresholds without Australian consent. Every shipment is tracked through the entire nuclear. This matters enormously in 2025 because the world is trying to get off Russian nuclear supply. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the US moved to ban Russian-enriched uranium imports. Europe began urgent diversification. Utilities that had relied on Russian enrichment infrastructure for decades suddenly needed a trustworthy alternative. Australia is structurally positioned to be that alternative. The World Nuclear Association revised its uranium demand growth forecast upward to a 5.3% compound annual growth rate through 2040. Global nuclear investment grew at 14% CAGR between 2020 and 2024. And the country sitting at the center of all of this, with the world's largest reserves, its most trusted safeguards framework, and new mines ramping up, is Australia. Not loud, not aggressive, just unavoidable. Now, let's talk about China, because their uranium situation is one of the defining energy stories of the next 2 decades. China's nuclear ambition is extraordinary. By the end of 2024, China had 102 nuclear reactors, either operational, under construction, or approved with an installed capacity of 113 million kilowatts. In 2025, the government approved 10 more reactors. China's official target is 200 gigawatts of nuclear capacity by 2035. Some projections suggest potential expansion to 500 gigawatts by 2050. That is the most aggressive nuclear build-out in human history. And it has one enormous problem. China's own uranium reserves are estimated at no more than 200,000 tons, roughly 1/8 of Australia's proven resources. To make matters more stark, in 2023, China's uranium consumption already exceeded 11,000 tons. By 2040, the World Nuclear Association projects China will need over 40,000 tons annually. The gap between what China has on the ground and what its reactors will need is immense. Right now, China fills that gap through imports primarily from Kazakhstan, which supplied 66% of China's natural uranium in 2023. That's over 11,100 tons from a single country. China has also invested in equity uranium mines across Namibia, Niger, and Uzbekistan. Its national policy has long been to source uranium through 3 channels: domestic production, equity mines abroad, and open market purchases. In July 2025, China made headlines by extracting its first uranium from the Ordos Desert in Inner Mongolia, 1 year after the National Uranium No. 1 project broke ground. Chinese geologists announced a potential deposit of 30 million tons, which, if accurate, would be among the largest in the world. But here's the important nuance. That figure is preliminary. Full geological surveying has not confirmed it. And even in the best-case scenario, building domestic extraction infrastructure at meaningful scale would take a decade or more. In the meantime, China remains one of the most import-dependent major nuclear powers on Earth. And that means Australia's uranium already flowing to China under a bilateral nuclear cooperation agreement remains a key piece of the puzzle. Here's where the story tightens into something urgent. The world is not facing a uranium shortage in the sense that the resource doesn't exist. Australia alone has enough in the ground to supply global reactors for decades. The problem is getting it out of the ground fast enough. The World Nuclear Association revised its mine development timeline in 2025. It now estimates that bringing a new uranium mine from discovery to production takes between 10 and 20 years, up from its previous estimate of 8 to 15 years. Output from existing top-producing mines is expected to halve between 2030 and 2040 as deposits are depleted. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan, which produces roughly 40% of global uranium supply, is moving to nationalize its uranium sector, which introduces political risk into supply chains that Western utilities had come to depend on. Russia controls significant enrichment infrastructure and has moved to restrict exports to unfriendly nations. Western buyers are scrambling to secure long-term supply from stable, treaty-bound sources. Australia is the obvious answer. But Australia has its own complications. Within Australia, uranium mining policy is a patchwork of state regulations. Western Australia still has a ban on new uranium mines. Some states allow only exploration. The Jabiluka site in the Northern Territory, one of the world's larger high-grade deposits, remains blocked from development. There's positive movement. The AUKUS nuclear submarine partnership signed in 2024 has created genuine bipartisan momentum around Australia's nuclear capabilities. Industry advocates are confident that state-level bans will eventually be lifted. But the timeline matters. Investment decisions made today determine whether mines are producing in 2034 or 2039. And reactors being built right now need fuel contracts signed years in advance. The world needs Australian uranium faster than Australian domestic politics currently move. Let's bring this down to what it means in practice. Countries holding nuclear cooperation agreements with Australia are in a strong position. They have access to the world's most transparent, legally accountable uranium supply from a nation with a world-class mining sector, strong environmental standards, and no nuclear weapons ambitions. Countries that relied heavily on Russian nuclear supply without building alternatives are now facing real supply chain risk. And for anyone thinking about Australia as a place to live, invest, or build a future, here's the lens I'd put on this. Australia is not just a country with sun and beaches. It is a country with extraordinary mineral depth uranium, lithium, rare earths, copper, iron ore that creates structural economic stability that most nations cannot match. Uranium alone generated over $1 billion in export earnings last year, from a sector that employs roughly 1,400 workers nationally and operates with some of the tightest environmental standards in the world. The Goldman Sachs forecast puts uranium prices reaching $90 to $100 per pound by end of 2025, potentially exceeding $110 per pound in 2026. Prices were below $40 per pound as recently as 2021. That's not a price spike. That's a structural repricing of a resource the world has decided it cannot do without. The World Nuclear Association is now forecasting 5.3% compound annual growth in uranium demand through 2040. This is a decade-long story, and Australia is sitting at the center of it. Let's land on what's genuinely unusual about this situation. Australia holds the world's largest uranium reserves. It exports that uranium under the world's most stringent, peaceful use safeguards. It supplies fuel to reactors powering cities in Japan, France, the UK, the US, South Korea, and China. And it uses none of it at home. For 25 years, nuclear power has been effectively banned in Australia by federal legislation. That ban is now being debated at the highest political levels, with AUKUS as the catalyst and economic pragmatism as the driver. The country with the biggest nuclear fuel tank in the world is starting to ask whether it should run its own engine. So here's what I want to know from you. Should Australia use its own uranium to power its own future, or keep exporting it while the domestic nuclear debate plays out? And if you were moving to Australia, would a stable, resource-rich economy backed by critical minerals like uranium factor into your decision? Drop your answer in the comments. This is the kind of question that doesn't have a simple answer, but it has a very important one. If you found this valuable, share it with someone making big decisions about their future. And subscribe to Stray a Lens because this is exactly the kind of data-driven, no-hype content we're built for. See you in the next